This is the second of two lectures on Yambo Ouologuem's Le Devoir de Violence, or the duty of violence, sometimes translated, has been translated also as bound to violence. And this, again, is simply a close reading of the text, and it's particularly geared for newcomers to the text who can understandably feel overwhelmed by what they encounter. Because in literary terms, it's a very challenging text to read. It's a very aesthetically challenging text, but it's also commenting upon a history that's not that well known for, let's say, readers in the United States context. So if you don't really understand the history that he's alluding to, sometimes it can provide challenges for you. So all we're really doing here, we're not commenting on the complicated history of its reception and all of the debates about this text. We're just trying to look at the text and read it so that newcomers can gain access to it. Now, let me show you here. There's again Yambo Ouologuem. You can see he was born from 1940 to 2017, and this is material that I discussed in the previous lecture. And if you haven't seen that, you probably should watch that one first before you continue here. Now, in the first lecture, we looked at the first chapter from the text, the legend of the Saifs, and we're examining the complicated references to the Tarikhs, the Tarikh al fattash, and the oral griot traditions as well, and that history that he comments upon. And this in this lecture, we're going to look at the latter three chapters: the ecstasy and the agony, the night of the giants, and dawn. Now, in the second, we'll start with the second section, the ecstasy and the agony. And this area, whereas the first chapter is really dealing with that section of history of the Askiyas, the second chapter is drawing from the era where the Macina Fulani and the Umarian Tijanis, the Tukuloor Fulani, got into a war in the 19th century, mid to late 19th century. And so this is right before the coming of the French to this part of West Africa. And so again, this is akin to a poem. This is poetic. This is fiction, but it's commenting upon an actual history. And so if in the first chapter, the Saifs are drawn from what he's calling the Saifs, which we said was a word that means sharif, essentially shortened form of sharif, a new word that he coins or invents. In the second chapter, he's still going to be referring to the Saifs, but in this case, he's addressing the Saifs have transformed into figures like Seku Ahmadu, who we also talked about in the first chapter as well, and possibly Hajj Omar Tall, who was the Sufi militant who brought Tijani Islam to West Africa in the mid 19th century. And then in chapter 3, again, as we'll discuss, we're going to see what happens after the French arrive in the late 19th century throughout the 20th century. So let's go right into our reading now. Hajj Omar Tall is very well known in West Africa, perhaps not as well known outside of West Africa. He was the dynamic Fulani, Tukuloor, Tijani Sufi militant who brought this new interpretation of Islam to the region in West Africa. I have on the same website, I have lectures on the life of Hajj Omar, told by Mamadou Thiam, who was a foot soldier in the army of Hajj Omar. We're not going to go too much into this history, and in fact, in the novel that Yambo Ouologuem wrote, this is a shorter, more compressed depiction of this, and arguably, remember, Yambo Ouologuem himself was Tijani. He remained loyal to the order and to Hajj Omar throughout his life. So I'm not suggesting that he's deliberately criticizing Hajj Omar, but at this time he was also not quite as devout as he became in his later years. And there can be no doubt that he's commenting upon the events that took place in central Mali directly prior to the coming of the French when Hajj Omar decimated the army of Ahmadu, the son of Seku Ahmadu, and then had Ahmadu beheaded, and installed his own son Ahmadu Tall as the leader in Hamdallah, and then shortly thereafter, about a year or so thereafter, an uprising occurred, and Tall himself was chased out of Hamdallah and was chased with a couple of his sons up into a cave in Dogon country, very close to where Yambo Ouologuem was born in Bandiagara, and blew himself up in a cave. For the Tijani, they say he didn't blow himself up, but that he disappeared on that day, having departed life without having experienced death, and he's still said to be seen on the escarpments of Dogon country as well. So he's a saintly figure for his followers, and Yambo Ouologuem, it was one of his followers. And yet there are incidents in this text that seem clearly to allude to what happened in the time of El-Hajj Tall, and may be actually referring to Tall. But again, this is a fictionalized account of a history, but this fictionalized account of this history, like as we saw in the first chapter, which is alluding to events that took place in the era of the Songhay Dynasty of the Askiyas, and before that was Sunni Ali Bur. Here we find allusions to incidents that also took place during the time that El-Hajj Omar Tall came to central Mali as well, and into Dogon country. Now remember, it was Yambo Ouologuem's father and his family members, even before his father, who converted to the Tijani order and became Muslims, but while remaining Dogon, although Yambo Ouologuem, although many Dogon today are animists, the family of Yambo Ouologuem were Dogon who became Muslims. And so this is one of the reasons, Tijani Muslims, which was an order brought by these so-called Black Arab Fulani people to Dogon country. So this is one of the reasons why his perspective is so complex on these conflicts, and that's because although a Dogon man himself, he was also a Muslim and grew up in a Muslim setting among people who themselves, Dogon, many of whom were not Muslim. But Yambo Ouologuem's family was Muslim, and Yambo Ouologuem was himself a very devout Muslim for the large part of his life. Now, this is a map that shows you some of the key villages and cities, towns that during the era of El-Hajj Omar Tall. If you look to the left there, by modern-day Saint Louis in Senegal, you see Podor. That's where El-Hajj Omar Tall came from. That region, the Podor region. Alwar was the place where he was born. And Dingare, which is somewhere in the middle there, was the first village that El-Hajj Omar Tall established for his talibs or followers. And then if you look over to the right, you can see in Hamdallah, that was the capital of the Macina Empire, and Digumbare was the place where El-Hajj Omar reputedly died without having experienced death. Bandiagara is the place where El-Hajj Omar Tall, where the remains of Tall and his sons were brought by Tijani Tall, his nephew, who later came to rescue him, but he was too late. But in any case, Bandiagara was where Yambo Ouologuem was born, and so all that is Dogon country. So his whole Yambo Ouologuem's whole experience was wrapped up with this history, and so he's most certainly commenting upon this history as well as commenting upon the history of the time of the Askiyas that we reviewed in the first lecture. So I'll show you a few instances of this as we go through some of these key passages. And again, all we can really do here is just, we're just trying to get a basic entry into this text and understand some of the key ideas. It's a very complex text. This is just a basic introduction to it. Now, there you see the Saint Louis region. This was, if you look at Saint Louis, the town of Saint Louis, you can see there on the two photographs. This is this island off of the coast of Senegal, where the French launched their efforts to colonize this West Africa. And so the Saint Louis region where El Hajj Omar was born was really where the French imperial efforts began. And it was during the life of El Hajj Omar that they accelerated those efforts. And so one of the reasons why El Hajj Omar Tall left the Podor area, what was formerly known as the Tukuloor area, was that he didn't want to live under French colonial control. And so this pushed him into the interior because he felt that the Senegal region, the Saint Louis area particularly, was lost to the French, and there was no hope of escaping this French influence, this French colonial efforts in this part of West Africa. And so he left this part and went deeper into the interior, and this brought El Hajj Omar Tall into the Dogon area where Yambo Ouologuem and his family came from. But it's this conflict all of this. Remember, the French didn't get into West Africa until very late. Now, they were in Saint Louis off on this island, and there have been colonial efforts along the coast of Senegal, for instance, at Gorée Island, that go back to the time of the Portuguese, and Europeans had tried for a long time to colonize, but it wasn't until quite late that the French got penetrated into the interior of what today is Mali. And it was this that El Hajj Omar, in addition to being a jihadist, he was resisting French imperialism. And so this is the complex historical backdrop of some of the incidents that are being described in the second chapter, the ecstasy and the agony of this text. And this man is Faidherbe, Louis-Léon Césaire Faidherbe. He lived from 1818 to 1889. He was the colonial administrator of the French who developed the plan of 1854 to colonize the area. And so he was really the architect of the French colonization of West Africa. And as you can see, all of this took place, not around the time of the American Civil War. And that was in 1857 that Faidherbe, that his forces came into direct contact with El Hajj Omar Tall's Talibs. This was the only time in a town named Medina. This was the only time that they came into direct conflict, because El Hajj Omar Tall was seeking to move away from the French. And the reason why was because it wasn't that he was frightened of the French, but the French had superior military armaments. And so he knew that it would be very difficult, given the military technology possessed by the French, to defeat them in direct combat. And so instead, he went into the interior away from the French and effectively abandoned the Fouta Toro, Fouta Jalon area, except the hub of it in Dingare, where he started his empire, to get away from the French. And so Yambo Ouologuem in the second chapter is describing the conflict between the French and what he's calling the Saifs in this narrative, which is very similar. Some of the incidents that are being described here are very similar to the history of the incidents that took place in the conflict between the French and El Hajj Omar Tall. So let me read you one instance of this from this chapter. Here he says, Yambo Ouologuem says, a thoroughly displeased Saif ibn Isaac al-Hayt, with perfumed mouth and honeyed tongue, now orchestrated the mobilization of his fanatical people's energy against the foreign invader. This would be the French. So this is the resistance efforts against the French. Manufacturing new miracles upon a daily basis throughout the Nakim Empire. I might note that El Hajj Omar Tall was said to have performed many miracles himself, particularly gifted at finding water, causing rain to fall, and so on. The earth shook, tombs fell open, countless saints returned from the dead, streams of milk flowed wherever the Saif happened to pass. Visions of archangels appeared in the misty twilight. Wooden buckets from the village wells now brimmed with blood. During one of his travels, he transformed 3 pages from the Holy Book, or the Quran, into as many doves, which fluttered before his path, as if urging the devotion of the people to the sacred cause of the Saif. and with the skill of a true diplomat, he feigned his profound disdain for the material things of this world. All of this was business as usual. Now, again, some of these descriptions are quite caustic, ironic, sarcastic even. But these miracles that the Saif is said to have performed are not exactly the same miracles that were said to have been performed by Al-Hajj Omar Tall. But Al-Hajj Omar Tall, even today, his followers like to speak of the many, many miracles that he performed. And so he was able to do miraculous things. Now, one of the things that he did was he learned when he went to Mecca and met with Muhammad al-Ghali, the Talib of Ahmad al-Tijani, the founder of the Tijani order, was he developed this ability to go into retreat. It was a kind of like an oracle, and he would go into retreat, and from this period of withdrawal, where he wouldn't drink water or eat, he would just pray. He was believed to get directives from God. Now, he was not a prophet. He did not claim prophetic status, but he did feel that his jihad was divinely ordained, and that he had gotten permission from the prophet and from Ahmad al-Tijani and from Muhammad Ghali, whom he saw in visions. And he got ongoing directives about how to direct or proceed with his military ventures as he went deeper into the Sahel. And so, and one speaks of the many things that he did that were quite miraculous, again, even today. So it's hard not to believe that this is not in reference to Al-Hajj Omar Tall as well, who now is becoming like the Askiyas and Sunni Ali Burr and so on, and Seku Ahmadu, yet another Saif in this narrative. It says, but no matter how refined his religious stratagems, may Allah protect him from the evil eye, the Saif was finally compelled to renounce supernatural miracles in preference for the military arts, which had fallen into complete destitution. With his sword suspended in his right hand, Saif hewed a path as wide as a village road. The brave militants who were blessed by Saif imagined that they were invincible, yet they ended up as pale shades under a moonless sky, slaughtered by the thousands. As it was remarked in those days, however, they did not actually die. They merely returned to their celestial abodes on high. And then he says, and that is why the night lingers wider than the dawn of every passing day. Now, again, many of what he's saying, attributing to the Saif here, can also be a fair description of what happened during the jihad of Al-Hajj Omar. Now, for instance, each time that Al-Hajj Omar and his talibs, he had thousands of followers, thousands of disciples or talibs who were militants, would go into a village. Al-Hajj Omar would say, two things are going to happen today. We're either going to take this village, or when you wake up, you're going to be reclining on a heavenly bed, being attended to by the dark-eyed beauties. And his militants, they adored him. They did exactly as he said, and there were many, many people that died during his adventure in the Sahel. And so, while Al-Hajj Omar is indeed a venerated person, particularly say in Senegal today, he's considered a saintly figure, and the same is really true in Mali and other places in West Africa as well. But the memory is a little bit different in Mali, and that's because it's a little bit more critical in the eyes of some, particularly those who are not members of his order, because of how many people died during his jihad. And so, here's an image of, this is the sword that you can find, this sword of Al-Hajj Omar. It's in at least one of the swords of Al-Hajj Omar, that it was in the possession of the French for many years. The French, when they finally defeated Al-Hajj Omar, also stole his personal library. It's now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, but they finally returned the sword, and this is in the Black Civilization, History and Civilization Museum in Dakar, along with other items El Hajj Omar, like his slippers and so on. But he himself, he would raise the sword when he would go into battle, but he did not, with some exceptions, like in the case of his battle with Ahmadu before he finally took Macina. He generally would exhort his talibs to fight from afar, and would encourage them and try to make them brave in their efforts to defeat the heathen enemies that he was in battle against. Okay, here's a description in the way that Yambo Ouologuem will describe what happens. This is now the tirailleurs. These were the military veterans who there were many black African people who fought on the side of the French as well, and some later went and fought in World War II, for instance, on behalf of the French. Leopold Sédar Senghor was one of them. But so when he's describing here the tirailleurs, the veterans, he's describing these people who would have been local collaborators with the French in marching on the region. Now, there were people who, like, for instance, even El Hajj Omar's son, Agui Boutal, became a collaborator in a military sense with the French as well after he realized that it was no longer possible to resist the French. His brother, Ahmadu Tall, continued to fight the French, and later, when he realized he could not defeat the French, Ahmadu Tall retreated to what would be the northern Nigeria today to live with the fellow Fulani who were related to his mother. His mother came from that part of West Africa. But Agui Boutal collaborated with the French, and he did it largely because his brother was there was a rivalry between him and his brother. They got into essentially a fratricidal conflict, and Agui Boutal didn't have a whole lot of choice. But for instance, Agui Boutal went with the French on the attack on Djenné, and so there were local people who collaborated with the French, but they did so not because they loved the French necessarily, but because they didn't have any choice. They were remember, the French had a lot stronger military power. Particularly, they had howitzers, these cannons that locals didn't really have, and so it was very difficult to defeat them with much less powerful weapons. But anyway, let's read this description. The long row of officers in charge of the loitering, this would be the French officers in charge of the loitering tirailleurs, wearily slog their way through a winding path overrun with straggling brush. Each seeks to appear calm and ruthless, but Africa is always there, awaiting them in the bush. All is raped, sacked, violated, and the captives, numbering around 8,000, are rounded up into a herd, which the colonial parcels out. Now, this is what El Hajj Omar himself took many captives as well, and oftentimes after El Hajj Omar would take a village, the captives would be the male captives would be beheaded, the women would be parceled out among his followers. But the French are following suit in this as well. The tirailleurs, enlisted men, non-commissioned officers, and commissioned officers are in charge of so many slaves that it is impossible for them to count them, much less feed and lodge them. The march continued, peopled by a nightmare of towns and villages that resisted them, attacking them in the nights behind their columns, dropping hundreds of bee nests upon them. But such efforts amounted to little more than mild annoyances that did not prevent the whites from regaining their composure and later dispatching black tirailleurs, the true shock troops, to break the spirit of the village once it had been sacked by the invading soldiers. And so, so essentially, El Hajj Omar and Ahmadu, the son of Seku Ahmadu, get into a sectarian conflict, essentially a civil war. The region is effectively decimated, and so the French do march in a military sense and do exactly what Yambo Ouologuem is describing here. But remember, they were only able to do it because the area was so weakened because of the conflict that had taken place between these competing Sufi brotherhoods, that both of whom were Fulani, or these black Arab Muslims. And so, so here we find this. So this is a compressed description of this history as the French are coming deeper into the region. Now, here's an image of the French fort at Medina. This is the only direct conflict that Al-Hajj Omar himself got into with the French. And there on the, and lost, and there on the left, you see a howitzer. Now, the army of Al-Hajj Omar had two howitzers that they had found that the French had been forced to abandon. And this gave them a great advantage when they came into Mali and fought, let's say, against the Bambara of Segu, or against the forces of the Macina, Fulani, and Hamdallah. But the French had a lot more of these howitzers. And so I think, this is an important point to remember, is that that it was a sheer matter of military power that enabled the French to do what they did, or to conquer this area. But the context, again, was an area greatly weakened through this sectarian conflict between opposing Muslim brotherhoods. This, again, is a map of the empire that Al-Hajj Omar established for a very short time before the French came in, and this empire was, effectively came to an end. And here's what Yambo Ouologuem says. Thus the old empire, faithful to its custom of tribal warfare, tore itself to shreds over hundreds of kilometers of massacres, razed missions, slashed throats, firestorms launched by the emperor, who ordered that the heads of all white captives be mounted upon the shafts of his men's lances and spears. And this is where then he says, this is quite interesting. Again, remember, he's speaking the unspeakable here. And after this novel was published, this was in locally in Mali, it was like, it wasn't that people in Mali denied the truth of what he was saying. It was rather, well, why is he saying it? Because he's speaking things that should not be said, saying the unsayable. But history is mysteriously silent about certain facts, about selected acts of villainy, tragic derelictions of duty, cowardly appeasements, and sudden about-faces. Thus it was that Saif, surveying this disaster from the bush outside of Toma, and realizing that all was lost, unsheathed his saber in order to cut his own throat. It was not to be, for his son hurled himself upon his father just in time for his father's golden blade to shear off his own head, which fell like a stalk of wheat upon the earth. More than anything else, this incident dispirited the Saif, who capitulated to the French that very morning. And so, again, this is a fictionalized account. This is a fictional incident, but he's describing this moment when this transition occurs, and the Saif is defeated, and the French are able to take over the region. And this is indeed what happened finally when Ahmadu Tall, when the Macina were destroyed. And then Ahmadu Tall had to retreat with his few remaining followers to northern Nigeria, and Agibou Tall joined forces with the French. And then later, the French installed Agibou Tall to rule on their behalf in Bandiagara, which is the very city where Yambo Ouologuem was born. So he's describing in a fictional form this moment of transition, and he's making of remember, he's creating this fictional lineage of Saifs extending back to the Askiyas and so on, but he's now suggesting that local figures like Seku Ahmadu, Hajj Omar are fit into this trajectory as well, who later then become under the control of the French. The empire, the Nakim Empire, again, remember, a fictional empire, was pacified, now parceled out in numerous geographical zones partitioned by the whites. The black rabble, rescued from slavery, joyously welcomed the white man, whom they hoped would make them soon forget the organized cruelty of the Saif. So again, remember, as we said in the first lecture, the so-called black rabble, the Negre, are black people, like Dogon people, like Yambo Ouologuem himself, who have no claims to noble status, no Sharifan blood, no link to the family of the Prophet Muhammad. And so they are the ones who've been on the receiving end of the Sharif's reign of terror and cruelty. And so they don't have anything really invested in preserving the power of the Saifs from this perspective. They welcome the French, much like many people in 2013 when jihadists took northern Mali, welcomed the French. Let's say in Paris, in Bamako, where parades were organized in order to drive out these people who come into the north. So you get these interesting dynamics where history seems to repeat itself. But again, remember, he's telling us the story of the Black Rabble from below, this history of this oppressed class who welcomed the French in order to escape the tyranny of the Saifs. This map will show you, if you look in blue, you can see during the apex of the French colonization of Africa, they controlled a vast amount of territory. Now, like Nigeria, Ghana went to the British. Togo went to the Germans for a time. Sierra Leone was British. Liberia became effectively an African American colony of Black Americans from the United States. But the French, they gained a vast amount of territory. So if one goes, say, to Paris today and looks at the great wealth of Paris, it was Frantz Fanon who said, Europe is literally the creation of Africa. Well, certainly that's true in the case of Paris, in the sense that what Fanon meant by that was it was built with the wealth of Africa, with the wealth that was taken from Africa during the colonial period. This is why, say, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso urged his fellow African presidents during the time that he was president of Burkina Faso not to pay the foreign debt to European nations. It was for Sankara, it was more a question of reparations than debt. And this was a very Fanonist view as well. But in any case, the French finally were able to get into Mali. They took control of Mali, and this is the beginning of this era that he's going to describe in the third and the longest chapter of his novel, the era when the French are ruling Africa, but they're also the French had a policy of ruling indirectly, so they would install local notables to rule on their behalf. So the notables were under in theory anyway, it was the French that were in charge. But as Yambo Ouologuem is going to point out, the clever, crafty Saif was in effect, really in charge by hoodwinking the French, who weren't really fully aware of all of the dynamics that were taking place in these more remote places that they had conquered. Now, again, if we think, like, for instance, his name was Joffre, was this French general who took Timbuktu. He also wrote a book about it. I think it was entitled "The March on Timbuktu." But he also was a general in World War I. So we're talking, we're talking about a period that was very late in the 19th century, and the French, didn't get in there till late, and their control of the area was relatively short-lived, say, in comparison to other places where Europeans had colonized. Here's an image of Agui Boutal. This was the son of El Hajj Omar Tall, who ruled in Bandiagar. And again, as I said, I have lectures on the same website on El Hajj Omar if you're interested in this history. Okay, so here's how Yambo Ouologuem describes what happened. He says, meanwhile, forced to retreat to his palace at Tillaberi Benita, the emperor with his only young son seated upon his right, as the marabouts prayed and the griots of the court sang his praises, endured a period of imposed silence until December 20th, 1900, the day he was compelled to sign a peace treaty with the French. Surrounded by his court, which was as brilliant as ever and decked out in all the trappings of imperial splendor, The Saif sat upon his throne, his feet at rest upon a satin carpet with embroidered flowers of gold. His entire entourage of faithful vassals seemed only slightly more dejected than was normal, their depression betrayed by their eyes, which seemed to drown in pools of blackness. Saif beheld this dazzling world that was arrayed before him. It was as if his soul was being torn to pieces. He signed the treaty in a flash of somber impotence. Glory be to the only living God. 6 months later, the French extended an invitation to Marabu, his young son. Saif accepted the offer on his son's behalf. Now, again, this is a fictionalized account of these events that took place, but it is true that Agui Boutal, for instance, went to Paris where he was greeted, and so the description of what happened when he came to Paris, when the Saif's son came to Paris, is very similar to what happened when the son of Hajj Umar came to Paris as well and saw. And later, Agui Boutal was, for instance, awarded the Legion of Honor in Paris. It says, the Lord, holy is his name, had decreed that the arrival of the conquering delegation in France, and above all in Paris, would be an event for the ages. The most important personalities in France received the young Mabadou. The Champs-Élysées, the Arc de Triomphe, and the animated life of the great boulevards left the inexperienced young man speechless. On July 14th, 1901, he attended Longchamp's military review and was utterly enthralled. So these same things happened to Agui Boutal. Now, I might note, too, that although Agui Boutal ruled from his tata, or his fortress in Bandiagara, for a number of years as the regent, in effect, ruling on behalf of the French, he was, in effect, something of a pathetic figure, an impotent figure. Many of his own people no longer trusted him, and his power was not really, he didn't really have much power. But so the way that Yambo Ouologuem is describing the situation here, however, is that, in fact, unlike Agui Boutal, who was relatively impotent, the Saifs were in effect pulling all the strings. This is how Yambo Ouologuem is going to describe this period after the French control the region. And here's what Ouologuem will say. He'll say, twilight of the gods? Yes and no. It seemed more like a fading dream, or perhaps a turning point, the convulsion of an entire civilization. Before its ultimate demise, before its rebirth, or was it all of this mere sound and fury? A tear for the black rabble. O Lord, may you always take pity upon them. So, he's raising these questions here. He's not making a conclusive statement, but he is about what it all means, except to say that he is suggesting that it is the black rabble who, again, are the ones that are going to pay the highest price for these historical events. Now we want to move now into the third and longest chapter of the narrative, Night of the Giants. And I can only comment on a couple of incidents. There's a lot. This is a long chapter. We won't go into all of it here. I just want to alert you to what is most important in terms of understanding what's happening. And also, I think because this chapter, it's the most accessible. Those readers who come to it are going to, from let's say the United States or Europe, are going to struggle a lot more with the first couple of chapters, whereas this novel is going to read much more like a conventional novel. But there's a sense in which, again, the genre really fits the situation, because now we've moved into a different era, the era of French control, and so the form itself takes on a more conventional novelistic form, much like the genre of the novel in the French literary tradition. Remember, Yambo Ouologuem was educated in Paris as well. And so he's going to describe in this novel the experiences of a young man named Raymond Kasumi Spartacus from this village. And there can be no doubt that this figure is modeled after Leopold Sédar Senghor. And many of the experiences that he describes Raymond Kasumi going through are the same experiences that Leopold Sédar Senghor went through as well. Like, for instance, Senghor was a veteran, a war veteran, much as Raymond Spartacus Kasumi was. Now, he also is a figure. He becomes a kind of a figure of the comprador, and this is an important concept in postcolonial studies, postcolonial theories of decolonization. And I'm showing you a couple of pictures. There's Amilcar Cabral on the left and Frantz Fanon on the right. These are both theorists who wrote about the comprador. And so this is something we want to think about that's from Ouologuem's perspective. Senghor and Kasumi also are comprador figures. And so here, this shows us something of the influence of Fanon upon Ouologuem. And there's no doubt that Fanon indeed had an influence on Ouologuem, particularly in Ouologuem's work that he published not long after Le Devoir de Violence, or The Duty of Violence, and that was his letter, a Black Ghostwriter's letter to France, which is, generically speaking, somewhat similar to Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, although takes a more joking, mocking tone. But here's what Fanon says about the comprador. Famous concept of the comprador. The national bourgeoisie, or member of the middle class, discovers his historical mission as intermediary. As we have seen, its vocation is not to transform the nation, but prosaically serve as a conveyor belt for capitalism, forced to camouflage itself behind the mask of neo-colonialism. The national bourgeoisie, with no misgivings and great pride, revels in the role of agent in its dealings with the Western bourgeoisie. This lucrative role, this function as small-time racketeer, this narrow-mindedness and lack of ambition are symptomatic of the incapacity of the national bourgeoisie to fulfill its historic role as bourgeoisie. The dynamic, pioneering aspect, the inventive discoverer of new worlds aspect common to every national bourgeoisie, is here lamentably absent. So what Fanon is saying here, and he develops this in much more theory in his work, The Wretched of the Earth, is that the local bourgeoisie, or member of the middle class, he calls it a comprador, and the role of the comprador is to traffic in goods, in effect, and to serve as a kind of a middleman. And this is a bogus class, a class invented by the Europeans, in this case the French, in order to exploit the country more efficiently. And so you need, as Fanon will say, you need, if you got black skin, you need the white mask. And this is what the comprador is: the person who, exploits his own people, exploits his own country on behalf of and manages his nation on behalf of the Europeans rather than on behalf of his own people. And so Fanon is going to conclude that he's going to say there's only one thing the comprador class can do. It just needs to commit suicide. It just needs to. It serves no useful function. It's literally a worthless class. And so this figure, now many figures like Leopold Sédar Senghor were handpicked by the French to manage the nation on the French's behalf. And so oftentimes, the French would choose the best and the brightest, educate them with the explicit goal of having them manage the French Empire on behalf of the French rather than on behalf of the local population. So this figure, Kasumi, in this narrative, the experiences that he undergoes are very similar to the experiences that all of the comprador class throughout the French Empire also undergoes. So he's an emblematic figure, an allegorical figure, in effect, of the comprador class. If you're interested in this, Wretched of the Earth is perhaps the best place to go, but Cabral is a very important figure as well. You can return to the source, some of his selected speeches. And then also there's Yambo Ouologuem's his letter to Black France. This is translated. It's also in the Yambo Ouologuem reader if you want to read the English language version of this. Okay, so here's what Ouologuem says. He says the ever and I'm what let me maybe I should preface this by saying this he's going to there these are really some of the most important passages in the novel and that occur in this section. And here the Saif develops a very sort of clever analogy to talk about the role of the French versus the role of this the notables, or these sharifs, these Saif class of the black Arab class, those people who claim to have Semitic ancestry that they're going to use to exploit the black rabble. And he does this in this very clever way by comparing the Jewish people, the Jews, to the Saifs, and then the church to the French colonizers. So let's work with this a bit. Remember, throughout the narrative he calls the Saifs the black Jews. The Fulani don't describe themselves in those terms. They more commonly are thought of as the black Arabs. However, the stories in many stories of the Fulani's origin, they're said to have come from Syria, from Palestine. There's a lot of debate about where they actually come from. I do have on this same website El Hajj Seku Tall, who was the grandson of El Hajj Omar Tall, his views on this question, on the origins of the Fulani. You can examine that if you're interested. But here, Yambo Ouologuem, again, remember he was came from a family that was educated, and his father had money. But again, this is because his father was Tijani and essentially collaborated with the Fulani. But nonetheless, Yambo Ouologuem comes from this class calling the black rabble. So we're getting it from the perspective. Remember, this is from the perspective of someone who does not have the noble blood claims, does not make the noble blood claims that the Sharifs make. All right, here's what he says. The ever sly Saif, as if warning the abbey, this is the Catholic priest, later bishop, who comes, not to meddle in the affairs of others, discreetly reminded him of the theological foundations of his mission. The mystery of Israel, he observes, resides in its refusal to accept the gospel. Still, it is not for us to pass judgment, for the church, with its ecclesiastical hierarchy and dogmas, might be viewed by some as hypocritical. The first shall be last. Okay, now I'm going to stop here. And as we're going through this, what you need to think about is when he says the mystery of Israel, he's really saying the mystery of the black Jews, or the mystery of the Saif. So it's ostensibly he's talking about Jews and their place, in history after the advent of Christianity. And then, so you have, Jews living, for instance, in predominantly Christian Europe, who don't convert to Christianity. And he's comparing him as a black Jew to Jews in this context. And so the church, then, every time we come to a reference to the church, we want to think of the French colonizers. And the French colonialism was aided and abetted by the Catholic Church, the French Catholic Church. Saif then gave a brief discourse on the subject of his own Jewish ancestry before he remarked with an evil smile. He said, Israel was here, after all, to call the church to vigilance. And so he wants to make sure the abbey understands his point. And when the abbey gets what he's saying, really understands what he's really saying, it seems that he's giving a theological discourse. But what he's really talking about is the exploitation of the black rabble and the imperialism in the region. When he was certain that the abbey had grasped his point, he quickly dissimulated. Vigilance in the matter of individual conversion, he said, warming to his subject. For it is erroneous to speak in broad terms of any whole-scale rejection or acceptance of Jesus Christ by all the people, for salvation is essentially an individual affair. Thus, to speak of Israel's defiance of the church, or its rejection or acceptance of the church, is to speak in terms that are far too general, if not erroneous. So again, it appears that he's speaking of Israel's, or the Jewish people's, refusal to accept that Jesus is the Messiah. But what he's really talking about is his own refusal to accept French imperial rule, his perseverance in his own power claim. Vigilance is also required against the danger that the church may become an end in itself. And finally, vigilance is necessary with respect to the very idea of a remnant, lest we fall into the error of imagining that man's fidelity plays any part whatsoever in ushering in the kingdom of God. This is certainly not the case, for the grace of God does not require the help of man to be enacted. Okay, before we go on, I want to just say this. Now, the idea of the remnant, which, as he says here, is introduced in the Old Testament. This is the idea that after the Babylonian captivity, when Jews are not allowed to come to Jerusalem or Palestine, they're held in captivity in Babylon for 70 some odd years. And when they finally are able to come back to Jerusalem, it's the prophet Ezra who insists that a remnant be preserved. This is really where Messianic ideology develops in this context. But if a redeemer or Messiah is to come who will save Israel, the Messiah has to come from a particular blood lineage. And so this is where, when he's just talking about the idea of the remnant, he's really talking again about blood nobility. And remember, Sharifan ideology is based in claims of blood nobility. So this is really what's going on here, is that Yambo Ouologuem is, we could say, deconstructing Sharifan ideology, which is to say the claims to privilege based in blood nobility. This is partly, what is implied in these passages. All right, so let's think about that as we continue. But this notion of a remnant that is introduced in the Old Testament is also present in the New Testament, as well as in the doctrines of the church. It constitutes a bond between the Old Testament and the New, marking their essential unity. It also remains the unifying element between the pre-Christian and the post-Christian church. So what he's talking about here then is Messianic. He's saying, look, the claims to chosenness, Messianic chosenness, the idea that there is a remnant that has been chosen by God, are not only in Judaism, they're also in Christianity. Now, this is, for instance, if we look at two of the Gospels have elaborate genealogies suggesting the Messianic connection between Jesus and David and then David's father, Jesse. And remember, King David was about 1,000 years before the time of Jesus. And so the genealogy establishes this, in the Gospels, establishes that Jesus is the Messiah. But if he is the chosen Messiah, he's a Messiah that comes through a particular blood lineage. And so what the Saif is saying is, it's not just, Jewish people, and in this case, he's referring here also to the so-called black Jews, the black Arabs, the Fulani, the people, the Sharif, those who make Sharifan claims, in effect, who adhere to the ideology of the remnant or affirm these Sharifan ideologies of blood nobility. It's also in the Christian church as well, as established through the Gospels. It's your own religious beliefs, he's telling the Christian bishop, are, also affirm this same kind of notion. And in fact, it's what you and I have in common. Now, in this case as well, this is also a commentary on racism, the idea that there are some people, like, let's say, to put it in racially essentialist terms, who are, better than others, not on the basis of their individual merits, but just simply on who they are. So let's say the French colonial invader who imagines that he's superior to local people just on the basis that he's a French white man. All right, so he's saying, look, we have this in common. We both think we're better than the black rabble on the basis of these bogus claims. And here, the Saif seems quite cynical. It becomes very clear that his claims to being, part of the chosen remnant are merely an ideology that cynically he does not really even believe himself. And then he says to the bishop, he says, your mission to convert the idolatrous Muslims and black Jews of the Nakim confronts the church with the timely question of why it bothered to come here in the first place, if not of its very existence. And so this sort of so-called civilizing mission, this desire to Christianize the local population, and the whole French colonial enterprise to, so-called white man's burden is being very radically brought into question here. And it's a quite interesting feature of this text, and there's a lot of complexity in these passages. And I think these two paragraphs that we've just sort of gone through tell us a lot about the views of Yambo Ouologuem, because remember, again, we're getting this from the perspective of somebody who himself comes from what he is describing here as the black rabble, or the Negré, this population that makes no claims whatsoever to being chosen or to having any noble blood flowing through their veins. So, again, we can only select a few passages. We've got to keep this reasonable, manageable. But I did want to briefly comment on this situation of how the comprador class is manufactured. And what's interesting is that he describes the rulers, the notables, the sharifs, as refusing to send their own children to the French schools. And so, but the French, because the French wanted compradors to rule on their behalf, they created laws to force the notables to send people to their schools. And so what the notables would do was they would have relations with women who were essentially slaves or from the lower caste, the black rabble caste, and then they would send those children, not their own noble children, to these schools. But this created a very strange dynamic, and this is one of the dynamics of the narrative as well, is that it becomes later the black rabble, like, let's say, Leopold Sédar Senghor, on whom Raymond Spartacus Kasumi is modeled, become the people that are going to rule the notables later, because they're the ones that received the education. And so this is the dynamic, that because the notables resisted sending their own children, they didn't want their children to be contaminated with the Catholic teaching, as in the way that, say, Senghor, for instance, converted to Catholicism. But in doing so, this set up a dynamic where the former black rabble now would be in positions of power. And this is something that he's going to comment on. So let's see how he described it. He says, Saif decreed that only the sons of slaves would be compelled to attend the French schools, to partake of the missionaries' masses, to be baptized by the white fathers, to adopt French dress, and to shave their skulls, while their families would be sworn to secrecy and suffer dire penalties should they prevaricate from their oaths. From these new and now legally sanctioned couples were born scads of children, whom the notables sent to the French schools and missionaries in place of their own. Because it was necessary that the French lies apply to someone, the notables made sure that they would apply only to the black rabble, whom they bred in large numbers on behalf of the settlers to build their roads, railways, and public works. This is, again, there was a lot of forced labor at this time too. And the whites never suspected that the notables were not allied with them. All the while the notables murmured in the ears of the people, "The white man has condemned you to a life of forced labor, to building his roads, thoroughfares, and railroad tracks, all for the sake of colonial commerce." The credulous people entered into devil's pacts with these wicked notables and aristocrats, who continued to prosper at their expense. So as we can see, this is a very complex dynamic that develops as the notables do everything they can to continue to hold on to their power in the time that the French have come to rule. And then he goes on to say, and we can't doubt here, I think, that this is that Yambo is sneaking in a little critique here. He says, and yet numerous local scholars whispered in low voices that the truth of the Saif was a complete fraud, that the Saif was little more than an impostor, and that his fabled noble quote-unquote blood was no more Jewish than the black rabble's blood was green. He pretends to be Jewish, this miscreant, merely so he can take pleasure in claiming to be superior to other blacks. But the truth is that he's no different from the white colonizers. Both of them want to civilize, quote-unquote, the Nakim, as if blacks are wholly lacking in the ability to tend to their own needs and govern themselves. Well, I think this is very clearly Yambo Ouologuem was known to say things very similar to this. He's putting this in the mouth of some of these so-called local scholars, but this was very similar to his own views. And I'll just give you one quick example of this. He was noted to have said that he was friends actually with Muhammad Ali, whom he met in the United States, but he was very critical of African Americans who changed their names to Arab names, like Lew Alcindor becomes Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Cassius Clay becomes Muhammad Ali, and so forth and so on. Because he said, look, at one point he said, it would be as if a Jewish person changed their name or named their child after Adolf Hitler. That's how strongly he felt about black people in America taking names that he didn't feel were black names, but were Arab names. And so this is a view that I think it's a pretty interesting and obviously complex dynamic at work that he's describing here. Now here, this is the king of Morocco, and I just note this in passing. You can see him there riding on the horse, and Morocco is a kingdom that, and this is true of other countries as well that are Islamic, that are ruled by kings, and the basis of their claims to nobility. Like, for instance, England has a king and a queen as well, Queen Elizabeth, who also assert claims to nobility. But the basis of these claims in this context is Sharifan links to the family of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, I note this again in passing because we're going to see that this novel is really a novel in some sense, particularly as we get to the end, about the birth of the new republic in Africa, very specifically in the case of Yambo Ouologuem, the Republic of Mali. But there are many other republics as well in Africa that emerge about this time. Now, if one were to read, say, the Declaration of Independence written in when the United States was formed, it becomes very clear that it's a long rant against King George. It's effectively a screed or an attack on the very idea of blood nobility. And so the Republican ideology in its very essence is egalitarian, and it implies a critique of the idea of the noble sovereign, because in a republic, like, let's say, as articulated by someone like Hobbes and also John Locke and Rousseau, sovereignty is dispersed over the entire body politique. But in a kingdom, sovereignty resides literally in the breast of the monarch or of the sovereign. And so the claim to being different from everyone else as sovereign is based historically on claims of nobility. And there are a lot of different ways that one can make these claims, but it always finally comes down to a matter of blood. And so this novel is effectively saying, if there's one of the messages of the novel, I would argue, is that if there's going to be a republic, if you're going to have a healthy republic, you're going to have to do away with the nobility, with the very idea of the nobility, as, for instance, happened, in the United States when it was formed. That if you're going to have a republic, you can't have you can't cling to the idea of blood nobility. But in a culture where blood nobility is very deeply ensconced, this becomes an obstacle to the emergence of the republic. So this is just something I would like you to think about. All right. So here again, I can't go too much into his experiences, Raymond Kasumi's experiences in Paris, because we don't have, it would take too long, but I'll just briefly say this. Here's a quote. It says, Raymond Kasumi was granted permission to pursue his studies in Paris, we're told, and would be sent there in 1 month, a few days before the opening of the school year, so that he might earn his baccalaureate. Now, this happened with Senghor. It also happened with Yambo Ouologuem as well. He was sent to Paris. He was one of the best and brightest and was chosen to go. Saif, who considered Raymond as his own personal property due to his, let's say, lower class caste birth, his education, his heredity, and his future, an instrument of the Saif's future politics, now required the serfs to show Raymond proper respect, heaping copious favors on him, opening his palms so wide that it seemed they would never be emptied of gifts. So Raymond then, so you have the situation where a member of the so-called black rabble has gone to the school of the Europeans, has acquired the knowledge, is going to be sent on to Paris to further his education. So Saif knows that Raymond is going to be in a very powerful position someday. So what effectively he's doing here is he's grooming Raymond. He's treating him as his own instrument, and he sees Raymond as as someone that will be a pawn in his power game against the French. Of course, the French have other plans. On the right, you can see this is one of these so-called school, des écoles des otages, or the school of the hostages. They literally called the children that were sent to these schools were literally called hostages that the French had taken. And because when they would go to these schools and receive this education, they would forever after be estranged from the people, from their family members and among whom they live. They would be people who didn't fit in either place. Achebe has a novel called No Longer at Ease, which effectively summarizes the situation of the student who went to these schools and would no longer be at ease in either culture, would be, as Homi Bhabha put it in one of his books, not quite not white in the European context, but in their own local context seen as effectively as freaks who no longer fit in with their fellows on the basis of their education. So this is the experience that Raymond undergoes. And Ouologuem tells us that his days from then on were like all those of all members of his generation. The first generation of the African bureaucrats, this would be the compradors that we've discussed, who lived a life of gilded prostitution under the power of the nobility. Rare commodities, somber geniuses to be manipulated behind the scenes, tossed into the maelstrom of colonial politics amid the warm smells of carnival and compromise. Deadly games where it was easy to lose one's equilibrium, where their master fell to the level of the slave who oversaw the other slaves, but believed himself to be the unrepentant equal of the white master, and where the slave thought that he was now the master of the master, who was in fact merely the slave who oversaw the other slaves. And so this is the situation of Kasumi. He becomes then the slave who oversees the other slaves once he becomes the president of this new republic. But remember, he's modeled after Senghor, and this is what he's saying about Senghor. And remember, Senghor converted to Christianity, or was a Christian, and he becomes, in this view, and he became the first president of Senegal, ruled for many years, but from this perspective, on behalf of the French, not on behalf of the Senegalese, and he becomes then the slave who oversees the other slaves. This is Yambo Ouologuem's critiques, and I think maybe now we're in a position to see again why Leopold Sédar Senghor was not particularly fond of this novel, and because Raymond was based on him. Upon his return from France, Raymond was officially welcomed at the newly constructed airport, accompanied by his French wife, Suzanne, who held their son Pierre by the hand. He was met by the governor and his high functionaries. Saif, the former dissidents who had been paid off by Madabu and won to Saif's camp, the impassive notables, and the ever delirious people. How happy was the son of Tambira to see on the eve of the elections how he was celebrated by all. Young and old, clerks and dignitaries, spoke to him, this is to Raymond, respectively, with true affection in their eyes, offering gifts of 2 sheep, 3 cows, 20 chickens, and more than 30 robes for his wife and son. For himself, they gave him Turkish slippers with red leather, finely embroidered with gold and stitching. So after many adventures in Paris, Raymond returns. He's married a white French woman, and he's welcomed at the airport, and he is welcomed by the Saif, and he thinks that he's going to rule, but he finds that the Saif has other plans. Now, there's a picture of Senghor with his wife. I actually had an opportunity to meet Yambo Ouologuem a number of years ago, and he said some very caustic things. He didn't like Senghor anymore. Senghor didn't like him, and he didn't like Senghor, but he was very critical of Senghor for marrying a white woman, at least in some of the remarks that he said to me. And you can see here again this dynamic in this narrative as well. Kasumi, who was a shrewd calculator, had nonetheless failed in his calculations. Armed with his degrees and the support of France, he had imagined that he was the master of the ancient master, or the Saif, only to find that the torch of Saif, after flickering for a brief instant, burned brighter than ever. He realized that he had won the election only because Saif had fixed it in advance. So he too is not able to escape the Saif. This is a very famous bookstore in Paris, Présence Africaine. This was a congress that was held, and there's a very prominent journal, Présence Africaine, that's still published. And this was this was an arm of Senghor as well as Césaire and others. And so I just mentioned this in passing because after this novel was published, Yambo Ouologuem made many people very angry with him, including Senghor. And so he had the full weight of the French African, Francophone African literary establishment poised against him, because this is a very important institution in France. But these people completely turned against Yambo Ouologuem, and Senghor did as well. He was not very popular among his fellows. Okay, the last chapter. This is in many ways one of the most, I think it's probably, well, it's a very important chapter, and it tells us a lot about Yambo Ouologuem's thinking about the coming of the new republic and what needs to happen for a healthy new republic to emerge. And it's specifically, again, linked to the demise of this Sharifan ideology, which Yambo Ouologuem sees as a very profound obstacle to the birthing of the new republic. And so he tells us about this practice of assassination by use of snakes. And so, for many years, the Bishop Henry, the Catholic priest, has been trying to figure out how the Saif has been able to effectively kill all of his enemies. And he finally figures it out. And when he does, he tells Kasumi about the method that has been adopted by the Saif to kill his enemies. And he says, "So you see, my poor Raymond, you had no choice. You didn't have any choice from the first day when you sat down upon the riverbank of the school. I've told you all of this so you can take the proper precautions in all of your dealings with Saif." He's warning him, that he too, if he crosses the Saif, he's vulnerable to being attacked in the same way. "For tomorrow you are certain to be elected. Don't forget that after 45 years of patient efforts, I've not succeeded in accumulating a single scrap of evidence against the Saif. I must go now to Tilbury Benita." So the bishop is going to, he's figured out how Saif kills his enemies. He's going to go and meet with him and confront him at this very crucial moment where Raymond Kasumi is now going to be the president of the republic. And Raymond says, "Well, look, that's suicide. You shouldn't go there." And then it's very interesting what he says in response. He says, "I'm going to the house of Machiavelli or Judas. Don't forget, tomorrow you will be elected. Tomorrow is your day, my child. Good night." So he's saying essentially, what does he mean? Well, there's Machiavelli. He's the father of political realism. And there is Judas, who famously betrays Jesus with a kiss. So he says, tomorrow we're going to find out one of two things. Is Saif willing to become Machiavelli, or is he willing to become, or is he going to betray the new republic? And so there's this moment of confrontation, and it's very interesting what happens. And let's think about this choice that he's going to present the Saif with, to become Machiavelli or to become Judas, and effectively a betrayer of the new republic. And we'll see what happens. He says, Bishop Henry says to Saif, "I dreamed about Nakim and its entire history. I prayed for it." "And what did you learn?" replied Saif. And he says, "Men kill each other because they don't know how to keep a conversation going." This is a very important observation. I can't read you all of their conversation. It's very complex, but we're just going to read a few key passages. But what Bishop Henry is going to urge is this idea of keeping a dialogue going. In other words, he's going to try to persuade the Saif to stop killing and instead use diplomacy, in effect. So here's how Yambo Ouologuem describes this. He says, this is when they're playing this chess game. And it ends with these two men, Bishop Henry, who is, again, the figure of the French imperial colonizer, and Saif, the pre-French colonizer with claims to blood nobility. He stroked his lips to hide a smile, and then he arose to get his chessboard. He brought it back along with the bamboo flute that he set on the floor as if trying to justify himself. So we know that inside the flute is the snake, and Bishop Henry has figured out that it's the snake. And so quite possibly he's going to assassinate Bishop Henry. But Bishop Henry is he knows very well what's inside that flute, but he's going to try to talk the Saif out of using this form of assassination against him and against all of his political enemies. Saif says to Bishop Henry, "I warn you, I don't know how to play. I can't. This game that you want to play, I don't know how to play." And so he wants him to play the game. And so we can think of it as being a conversation. Saif is being urged to participate in a conversation, but we could think of conversation as a game. And it was, of course, Wittgenstein and Heidegger and others who like to think about discourse as having the character of a chess game. And so entering into a conversation with the other is to enter into a game with the other that has rules. And he wants Bishop Henry wants Saif to play the game, to learn to be a player of the game, the game of diplomacy, the game of speaking, rather than simply opting for killing his enemies. He says, "It's simple, you see, you just play the game. You play it without being played upon, but you must constantly keep your eye on the moves of your opponent." So again, he's urging him to become a Machiavelli, to use his words rather than merely violence. You must use his words, in a ruthless political realist sense, but words nonetheless. So you have to figure your enemy out. You must want to know how to figure them out rather than just, killing your enemy. So say to yourself in both a literal and figurative sense. All right, now there you see this. This is a very deadly African snake, like the kind of snake that Saif might have used to assassinate his opponents. You have to say, "I want to play the game in such a way that they don't see me playing," entering into it without drawing attention to yourself, encouraging your opponent to imagine that you agree with him, misleading him without letting on or forcing it, nor of deviating from the rules of the game, untangling its knots, but cautiously, never laying a finger upon it until you first succeeded in figuring how it works. Without being cautious, my dear friend, can you succeed in killing your opponent in the game? So, political ruse, political realism, play the game, be treacherous, but be treacherous by playing a game and make sure and understand that it's a game that has rules. If it is a game, all games have rules, which means you have to agree to play by the rules. So if you kill, in effect, with the use of a snake, as Saif is doing it, you're not playing by the rules. This is the point that he's making. So he's urging the Saif to abandon this kind of cheating by using assassination, and instead become a better player of the game, which is what would be entailed in this new enterprise in the advent of the Republic. Saif understood. He knew that Henry, he realizes that Henry has figured out about his snakes, but the bishop remained imperturbable. The strong player is the one who manages to hold his ground, but without tipping his hand. And lifting his eyebrows as if surprised, he politely remarked, "That's the nature of diplomacy, to replace force by ruse." And this is what he's urging the Saif to do, to replace force by ruse. That, and in effect, if the new republic is to succeed, those people like the notables who have been in power and have used assassination to get what they want, they have to learn to play this new game that is the game of the new post-colonial Republican state. Ruse, Saif repeated with circumspection, nearly with fear, as if he sensed in his interlocutor's calm smile a mysterious and supernatural power. "In other words, freedom," responded Henry. "The idea of liberty is not a simple one. It takes many forms, like the structure of the game. The same idea has a multitude of moments. At the moment when an idea reveals itself, it is finally inseparable from its definition. Men believe themselves free at the moment that the law is recognized and articulated. Play. I will teach you the rules. You will exist. You confront life in a brotherly confrontation of all your forces, and you play, you calculate, play with some, play some more, adapt, make mistakes. Yes, no, careful. No movement is without meaning, so you calculate. Okay, so remember Yambo Ouologuem was trained in philosophy as well as in literature. He was very he read very widely, and the idea of liberty, let's say, as articulated by someone like Rousseau, once you enter into the social contract, you gain an experience of freedom, but the price that you pay is by relinquishing, leaving what Hobbes and Rousseau are going to call state of nature, which is a state of lawlessness. So law itself is founded upon the renunciation. About you have to give something up if you want to experience what he's calling liberty here. So liberty is freedom, but freedom is not the same thing as anarchy. Freedom, the very idea of liberty, let's say a liberal democratic state with a Republican Constitution, implies rule of law. This is what he's urging, the Saif to embrace, is rule of law. You'll get an experience of freedom, you'll get liberty, but it requires that you play by the rules, that you accept the law. You impose a prohibition on yourself, and so anarchy is not the same as liberty. And so he's telling the Saif, look, what you're doing is anarchistic. What I'm offering you is liberty, an experience of freedom, but freedom within the law. If you play the game, you'll get freedom, but you have to play the game. You can't cheat anymore, essentially. Here's what Henry says. He says, right without force is caricature. Force without right is misery. Swear it. All right, so right without force is caricature. Let's pause on that for just a minute. Now, Kant is going to say, a law that's not backed up by force is no law at all. That laws have to be backed up with force, or then it just becomes a joke. And but force without right is misery. And so if you just impose power, Rousseau makes the same point in the social contract. It's miserable to live by rule of just pure power and force. It becomes the law of the jungle, the law of no laws, which is, again, a state of anarchy. And so he's saying, leave that state, enter into a state of lawful associations, use ruse, be crafty, but play by the rules. If we're going to have a new republic, we're going to have to play by the rules. You're going to have to accept the rules of the republic. And then it's interesting that the way that Ouologuem describes it here, and I think this is why this novel is finally an optimistic novel, as opposed to those who have criticized it for being perhaps a pessimistic, cynical account. The Saif, he tells us, picks up the flute and tosses it in the fire, and then he returns and sits down across from Henry. And Henry says, it's a game. And then he added in a different voice, it's a game that has its rules. And so it seems at the conclusion of this novel, this is why he calls it Dawn, we have the Saif finally accepting a new order, a new law, the law of liberty, playing by the rules instead of cheating in the way he has in the past. Now, this is underwritten by a little parable that Yambo Ouologuem tells earlier. I'm gonna read this for you because I think this also is an apt encapsulation of what he's saying here at the conclusion of this novel. You think of the law as being something that binds you to the other. Here's how he describes it. He says, the Chinese have a game, they call it the tie that binds. They capture two birds, which they bind together, not too closely, thanks to a thin but solid long line. The line is so long that the birds, once they are thrown up in the air, fly away, soaring up towards the sky. Believing themselves free, they revel in the beating of their wings, making great turns, but suddenly crack. They are snapped backwards by the line. They fly crazily in all directions, turning and twisting about, blood dripping from their fluttering wings that trickles down, along with feathers and bird down, upon those who have come to watch the spectacle. The Chinese find this funny, highly comical and refined. They shake with laughter. Sometimes the string gets wrapped up in some tree branch or around the birds themselves, and they struggle against one another, pecking out each other's eyes, beaks and claws, or when Providence doesn't impale them on the branches, having reached the end of the game, one of them dies, alone or with the other. Sometimes they both die, together, strangled, eyes pecked out. All right, so the law is, in effect, we are bound to the other, and we are inseparably bound to the other. There's no escape from this. And this little parable, comments upon this. And he tells us, he says, the human race is a bird of this type. We are all victims of this game, separated from one another, but forcibly bound, all without exception. Now, in the image below, this is from the Dogon, and these are initiates who are being circumcised. Circumcision is precisely what is implied in this analogy. In circumcision, one is bound. Circumcision is a mark. It's like we could think of it as a mark that cuts, that separates one from the other, but also binds one to the other. Now, in the West African context, for many centuries, tribal scarification was also practiced, and it has a very similar function. If you, for instance, receive a scar on your face that is a particular mark of a particular tribe that you belong to, that scar that you receive or that mark links you to a particular community, but it separates you from other communities as well. So we can think of this tie that binds this, the imposition of the law as being something that both links you to something or to someone, but also separates you from them. And so this is a point that he is making here as well. But it's although he uses the analogy of this Chinese game, it's very much linked to the question of circumcision itself, which is a very ancient practice throughout Africa and the Middle East as well. So I don't want to say anything much more about that, but for instance, if you're interested in the thought of Derrida or Freud, you might find a lot here to reflect upon. And this is the conclusion of the novel, the last paragraph in the conclusion of this lecture as well, in which he says, often it happens, the soul dreams that it can hear an echo of happiness from days long ago. But once cast into the world, one cannot fail to grasp that Saif, mourned 3 million times, is ceaselessly reborn to history under the warm cinders of more than 30 African republics. So he's thinking, there you can see the symbol of the Republic of Mali, one people, one goal, one faith. But regrettably, very recently, this country fractured into two parts. It was restored when the French came to Mali in 2013 and drove out the jihadists who tried to establish this state that they called Azawad in northern Mali. And so the republic was restored. But he's speaking here not specifically about, not necessarily about Mali. He says, look, there's more than 30 African republics, but the same dynamic he sees as being at work throughout Africa. And so the project of forming a healthy republic is it's more difficult than one might imagine. And I think this novel has a great deal to say about the question of the formation of the republic, particularly in the last chapter.